A racist police officer confronts a black man standing outside a luxury store late at night. Suspicion and prejudice cloud the officer's judgment, leading him to accuse the man of loitering and escalate the encounter with harsh words and physical force. The confrontation turns violent as the officer punches the man, wrestles him to the ground, and arrests him on the spot. Only afterward does the officer realize the magnitude of his mistake. He has just assaulted and detained none other than Elijah Brooks. Under the soft glow of a street lamp, Elijah Brooks adjusted his suit jacket, looking around the quiet street outside a luxury boutique. The store had been closed for hours, its large windows dark and reflective. He glanced at his watch, noting how much time had passed. His assistant, Malik, was running late again. Elijah let out a sigh, the chill of the evening seeping in as he waited, hands in his pockets. Elijah, known by many as a respected figure in the city, usually had a busy schedule, and nights like these were rare. Tonight, however, he'd wrapped up an important community event and needed to pick up some documents from Malik before heading home. Lost in thought, he hardly noticed the rhythmic heavy footsteps echoing down the street toward him. "Hey, you!" a sharp voice called out, snapping Elijah out of his thoughts. Elijah looked up to see a police officer, white, tall, and imposing, walking briskly toward him, his hand resting firmly on his belt. The officer's eyes were fixed on Elijah with a look that was far from friendly. Elijah recognized that look all too well. It was one he'd encountered more times than he cared to remember, a gaze that spoke louder than words. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, his voice carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't interested in polite conversation. Elijah straightened, his hands slipping out of his pockets. His voice was calm as he replied, "I'm just waiting for someone." The officer stopped a few feet away, looking Elijah up and down with suspicion. "Waiting? At this time of night? Outside a closed store?" The officer's tone was heavy with accusation. "Yes," Elijah replied, his patience starting to thin. "I'm waiting for my assistant. He's running late." The officer's face hardened, and he moved one step closer, the tension between them thickening. "Doesn't look right to me," he said, his hand inching a bit closer to the flashlight on his belt. "You sure you're not loitering? Or up to something else?" Elijah felt a surge of frustration bubble up, though he kept his expression neutral. He knew where this was going. Taking a steady breath, he replied firmly, "I'm not loitering. Just waiting here for a ride, that's all." The officer's mouth twisted into a mocking half-smile. "Standing around in a suit, huh? What's the occasion? Trying to look important?" The comment struck Elijah, and for a moment he felt his patience waver. He met the officer's gaze, his voice steady. "I told you, I'm waiting for someone." The officer moved in even closer, his posture more confrontational. "You don't exactly blend in around here," he sneered, his eyes narrowing as he looked Elijah up and down again. "This isn't a place for, well, just hanging around. Are you sure you're not trying to break into something?" Elijah's pulse quickened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had been through situations like this before, where explanations meant nothing and assumptions meant everything. But still, he kept his voice steady. "There's no need for accusations. I'm just standing here waiting, nothing more." But the officer didn't budge, his stance unwavering as his gaze bore down on Elijah. "Got any ID on you?" Elijah's jaw clenched, and he hesitated for a moment. He knew his rights and knew that he had every right to stand on this public sidewalk without being questioned. He also knew that this situation had escalated far beyond any reasonable point. "I don't need to show you my ID," he replied, a controlled firmness in his voice. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's expression darkened as he closed the distance even more, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "When I ask for ID, you show it, or maybe there's something you're trying to hide." Elijah felt his patience wear thin, his voice still controlled but edged with irritation. "I've told you what I'm doing, officer. That should be enough." The officer's face twisted in disdain, his hand hovering closer to his belt. "I'll decide what's enough. Not you. And right now I have every reason to keep asking questions." The two men stood there, locked in an unspoken battle of wills, the air between them heavy with tension. Elijah's eyes met the officer's, unwavering, but inside, he felt the familiar weight of frustration and wariness. This was far from the first time he had found himself in such a situation, where being in the wrong place at the wrong time had far more to do with the color of his skin than anything else. Finally, he glanced up the street, hoping to see Malik's car headlights, but the road remained empty, silent. Elijah's pulse was steady, but he could feel the tension spreading through his body. The officer had stepped even closer, looming, his hand inching toward his flashlight. The cool night air was thick with hostility, and Elijah knew that any move on his part could easily be misinterpreted. But he wasn't about to back down either. He squared his shoulders, meeting the officer's steely gaze. "Look," Elijah said, keeping his tone calm, "I'm just standing here waiting for my assistant. That's it. No need to escalate things." But the officer's smirk showed no sign of fading. "Funny how you keep saying that. Doesn't make it any more convincing," he sneered. "People don't just hang around here at this hour unless they're looking for trouble." Elijah's patience was slipping. This wasn't a typical neighborhood stop, and he wasn't some nameless face on the street. In another setting, the officer would know him by his title, by the countless news articles, or even by the policies Elijah had advocated for. Yet here, under the veil of darkness, he was being treated as a suspicious outsider. He kept his composure, though a flicker of irritation crept into his words. "Officer, I've explained myself. I'm just waiting. If there's something specific you need, let's make this quick." But his attempt to de-escalate only seemed to provoke the officer further. "Quick, huh?" The officer laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Real quick would be if you handed over your ID. Or maybe you're just trying to hide something. I'm starting to think you don't belong here at all." A flash of anger surged through Elijah, but he forced himself to take a slow, steady breath. The officer's stare didn't waver, his stance only growing more rigid with each passing second. "I belong here just as much as anyone else," Elijah responded, his voice unwavering, though the frustration in his tone was undeniable. The officer leaned in close, his eyes hard, voice low and brimming with hostility. "Well, then you won't mind showing your ID, would you? Or do I need to start searching for probable cause?" Elijah felt his patience wearing dangerously thin. "I've done nothing wrong and told you as much," he replied. "There's no reason for this to go further." The officer raised his eyebrow, his hand never leaving his belt. "You don't get to decide when this is over. I do, and right now, I'm not going anywhere until I'm satisfied." Elijah's fingers flexed at his sides, his mind racing. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. He had already experienced countless incidents of implicit bias and harassment, but this one felt different. This time, the hostility in the officer's tone and posture felt almost personal. Elijah's calm exterior masked a rising current of fear and anger, both emotions simmering beneath the surface. He spoke again, his voice a shade firmer, unwilling to let his composure crack. "Look, officer, if my standing here bothers you so much, I'd be happy to step across the street or wait in another spot. But I'm not breaking any laws standing here." The officer took another step forward, his face now only inches away. "It's not about where you're standing. It's about you thinking you can mouth off to me without consequences." His words came out like a warning, laced with a venom that sent a chill through Elijah. "Bookmark, go back." Elijah's patience was nearly gone. He held his ground, saying with quiet resolve, "Respect goes both ways, officer. I've been more than reasonable here." The officer's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger flashing across his face. Without breaking eye contact, he finally murmured, "We'll see how reasonable you're feeling when you're in cuffs." Elijah's pulse quickened, and he felt the familiar tightening of dread in his chest. He knew he couldn't let this go any further. What happens when standing up for yourself becomes a threat? Elijah held his ground, his gaze steady as he sized up the officer's stance. The entire situation had escalated well beyond anything reasonable, and he knew all too well that the officer was relying on intimidation to try and keep control. He wasn't about to let this officer's bias take him down without a fight. The officer's voice was low and taunting, a tone that set Elijah's teeth on edge. "You think just because you're dressed up, you don't have to answer my questions? You think you're above the law?" The statement lingered in the air, taunting Elijah. In a different scenario, with the respect that came with his title, Elijah knew this interaction wouldn't have escalated at all. But here, in the dark on this quiet street, he was just another face, another target for assumptions and suspicion. Elijah replied evenly, "I don't think I'm above anything, officer, but I haven't done a thing wrong, and I've given you an explanation. I have nothing to hide." His words were calm, but the officer's expression hardened, his irritation only growing. "You don't get to decide that," the officer snapped, his hand hovering near his handcuffs. "You've been standing here for 10 minutes, loitering around this closed store in a place you don't belong. Sounds like you're looking for trouble to me." Elijah's patience was wearing dangerously thin. "Waiting for a ride isn't loitering. I told you, I'm just standing here," he replied, clenching his fists at his sides. He couldn't believe that simply waiting outside a store was enough to provoke such intense suspicion and hostility. But the officer wasn't backing down. He stepped even closer, eyes narrowing. "Guys like you always think they can talk their way out of trouble," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "But I see through it." Elijah felt a wave of anger rise up, but he forced himself to stay calm. He took a deep breath and said, "There's nothing here to see through, officer. I'm just a person waiting on the street." The officer's face twisted into a smirk, his voice filled with scorn. "People like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this after hours. You think a suit changes that?" The words hit Elijah hard. "People like you." He'd heard that phrase before, but every time it cut just a little deeper. He swallowed his anger, replying with cold calm, "I have every right to be here, just like anyone else." The officer's smirk faded, his hand moving closer to his cuffs. "Watch your tone. I'm the one asking the questions here, not you." The officer's eyes flashed with challenge, daring Elijah to push back. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "You're questioning me for standing on a sidewalk. If I were doing anything wrong, wouldn't you have figured it out by now?" The officer's face darkened, his lips twisting into a frown. "That's just it. I have figured it out. You're loitering, looking for a chance to break into something you can't afford, and I'm not about to let you get away with it." Elijah felt a surge of indignation rise in his chest, the unfairness of the situation stinging more deeply than he'd anticipated. He tried to reason with the officer, to break through the unyielding wall of bias. "You're harassing me for no reason. I've explained myself. I haven't done anything wrong, and now you're just looking for excuses to escalate this." The officer took another step forward, his voice growing colder with each word. "You think you can just talk back to me? You think a suit and tie gives you the right to mouth off? That's not how this works." Elijah clenched his fists tighter, feeling the adrenaline starting to rush through his veins. The officer's hand hovered closer to his cuffs, and Elijah knew he was dangerously close to crossing a line. But he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. When a clash of egos meets unyielding bias, something has to give. Elijah's body tensed as he felt the officer's gaze, filled with barely concealed contempt. He took a steadying breath, determined not to let the situation spiral out of control. But the officer's hand inched closer to his belt, a smirk on his face that sent a warning chill down Elijah's spine. "You know what? I'm done listening to your excuses," the officer spat, reaching for his cuffs. "Hands behind your back. Now." Elijah's heart pounded. "I haven't done anything to deserve this," he replied, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "You're arresting me for standing on a sidewalk, for waiting for a ride?" The officer's smirk widened as he tightened his grip on Elijah's arm. "I'll tell you what I see. I see a guy loitering in a neighborhood where he clearly doesn't belong, and now I see a guy who's resisting a lawful order." "Resisting?" Elijah repeated, incredulous. He held his hands up, open and calm. "I'm not resisting anything. I'm telling you the truth, and you're choosing to ignore it." But it was too late. The officer's patience had snapped, and his grip tightened as he twisted Elijah's arm, forcing him toward the wall of the boutique. The cold glass pressed against Elijah's cheek as the officer held him there, breathing hard with the exertion, his voice low and menacing. "You can argue all you want, but tonight, you're coming with me." Elijah winced, the pain radiating through his arm. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was a show of power, an abuse of authority, and every second that passed drove the reality home. "You're making a huge mistake," he muttered through gritted teeth, his face pressed against the glass. "You're crossing a line." The officer only laughed, the sound echoing down the empty street. "Funny, I thought you were the one crossing lines by standing around here like you own the place." Elijah tried to hold back his frustration, but it was almost impossible with the officer's sneering voice in his ear. As the cold cuffs snapped around his wrists, Elijah felt a wave of anger wash over him. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here he was, treated like a criminal, all because of the assumptions this officer had made the moment he saw him. "You're going to regret this," Elijah said, his voice controlled but intense. He had seen officers get away with this kind of behavior time and again, but tonight, he wasn't going to let this slide. Not anymore. "You don't know who I am." "Oh, trust me," the officer replied, hauling Elijah toward his patrol car with a rough tug. "I know exactly who you are, a guy with an attitude who thinks he's above the law." Elijah clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had spent years working to reform policies to create change, and now he found himself on the receiving end of everything he had fought against. He felt the cold steel of the cuffs digging into his wrists, and a fierce resolve settled within him. If this officer was going to treat him like just another face, another target, then he would use that same system to show this officer and everyone else that this kind of abuse would not stand. The officer opened the back door of the patrol car, shoving Elijah forward. "Get in," he ordered, his voice full of authority and barely hidden satisfaction. Elijah hesitated, meeting the officer's eyes with a calmness that belied his anger. Then, in a low, steady voice, he said, "Before you throw me in that car, check my ID." The officer froze, his hand still on the door, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" Elijah held his gaze, unflinching. "My wallet's in my pocket. Take it out and check it. Trust me, you're going to want to know who you're arresting." The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly torn between anger and doubt. Finally, he reached into Elijah's pocket, pulled out the wallet, and flipped it open. For a moment his face remained blank, but then, as the name and title on the ID sank in, the color drained from his face, his jaw dropping in shock. You're the mayor?" he stammered, his voice shaky with disbelief. Elijah's voice was calm, his gaze unwavering. "That's right, I'm Elijah Brooks, the mayor of this city." As the officer's hands trembled, fumbling with the cuffs, Elijah saw the full weight of the situation begin to settle in. For the first time that night, the tables had turned. Bookmark go back. The officer had finally seen Elijah's true identity, but his nightmare was only just beginning. As Elijah's words sank in, the officer's face turned an even paler shade, and he blinked rapidly, his entire demeanor shifting from arrogance to shock. He fumbled with the cuffs, his once firm grip now shaky and uncertain. Panic flickered in his eyes as he finally managed to unlock them, freeing Elijah's wrists. "Sir, I didn't realize." His words trailed off, his gaze darting around as if searching for a way to undo what he'd just done. Elijah slowly rubbed his sore wrists, watching the officer with an expression of restrained fury. "You didn't realize?" he asked, his voice steady but with a dangerous edge. "You didn't realize because you didn't care to. You let your own assumptions dictate your actions." The officer stammered, his hands trembling as he backed up slightly. I thought you were just, someone loitering. I had to be sure." "You thought," Elijah repeated coldly. "That's the problem. You thought you knew everything about me the second you looked at me. And because of that, you treated me like a criminal." The officer swallowed hard, clearly struggling to find the right words, but everything he said only seemed to dig him deeper into his own mistake. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought." Elijah raised a hand, cutting him off. "You thought I was a threat? You saw me standing here and made your assumptions without asking a single reasonable question. Tell me, officer, would you have acted the same way if it had been someone else? Someone who looked a little more like you?" The officer looked down, unable to meet Elijah's eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Made a mistake." "Mistake?" Elijah repeated, his tone harsh, each word hitting like a bullet. "A mistake is forgetting your keys. A mistake is a paperwork error. This was more than that. You used your position to intimidate, profile and ultimately assault someone without cause. And if I hadn't told you who I was, where would I be right now? The officer's face flushed with embarrassment and regret, and his voice was as he replied, "Sir, I'm sorry. I really didn't mean for it to go like this. I was just trying to do my job." Elijah's gaze was unyielding. "If you think what you did tonight is part of your job, then you shouldn't be wearing that badge. Your job is to serve and protect this city, not to act on your personal biases." The officer's shoulders slumped as he took in Elijah's words, a defeated look settling over his face. The confidence he'd shown just minutes earlier was completely gone, replaced by a sense of fear that he couldn't hide. He struggled for words as if grasping for any excuse, but Elijah held up his hand again, silencing him. "I don't need an apology, officer. What I need is accountability. This isn't just about me, it's about how you and others use the power given to you." The officer's face was ashen, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, sir, I'll make this right. I just didn't know." "Exactly," Elijah replied, his voice cold and firm. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You saw what you wanted to see and acted on that alone." The weight of Elijah's words hung heavy in the air, and the officer's face turned downward, avoiding Elijah's gaze altogether. Elijah took a deep breath, letting the anger simmer down to a controlled burn as he spoke his final words to the officer. "I need your badge number, now." The officer's hands as he recited the number, his voice barely audible. Elijah took out his phone, typing in the information, and when he looked up, his eyes blazed with determination. "You'll be hearing from me again," he said, his tone final and unwavering. "And next time, it won't be as easy as an apology." With that, Elijah turned and walked away, leaving the officer standing there in silence, paralyzed by the weight of his own actions. The street was quiet, but Elijah's resolve was anything but. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. This wasn't just about one night, one officer, or one bad decision. This was about a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for far too long. And now, with the power and the proof to do something about it, he knew exactly where he was headed. The officer may have backed down, but for Elijah, this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. Elijah's jaw was tight as he walked briskly down the street, leaving the stunned officer behind him. The events of the night replayed over and over in his mind, the sting of the officer's words and actions cutting deep. This wasn't an isolated event. It was a glaring example of the unchecked authority and prejudice he had spent years trying to dismantle. Tonight had made one thing clear. There was no more time to wait. Change had to happen, and he was in a position to make it real. Elijah took out his phone and quickly dialed Malik's number. After a few rings, his assistant picked up, sounding breathless. "Elijah, I'm so sorry I'm late. I got stuck in traffic and—" "Malik, meet me at City Hall," Elijah interrupted, his voice clipped and resolute. "Right now." There was a pause on the other end, the surprise evident in Malik's tone as he replied, "City Hall? At this hour? What's going on?" "I'll explain when you get there," Elijah said, ending the call without waiting for a response. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and adjusted his suit jacket, his expression set with determination. Tonight was about more than just his own experience. It was a symbol of a systemic problem he had promised to address. And he was done with empty promises. The city's lights illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows on the quiet streets as Elijah walked. His jaw still throbbed from where the officer had punched him, a painful reminder of how quickly things had escalated simply because of assumptions. He pressed forward, a renewed sense of purpose driving his steps. By the time he reached City Hall, Malik was already waiting outside, his face etched with worry and confusion. "Elijah, what happened?" Malik asked, his brow furrowing as he took in Elijah's disheveled appearance and the bruise forming on his jaw. "You sounded intense on the phone. Are you okay?" Elijah sighed, pausing for a moment to collect his thoughts. "I was harassed and assaulted by one of our own police officers tonight, Malik. He saw me standing on a sidewalk, assumed the worst, and tried to arrest me for nothing more than looking suspicious in a suit." Malik's eyes widened in shock, his expression shifting from concern to anger. "Wait, he actually assaulted you? Does he know who you are?" "Not until I told him," Elijah replied grimly. And by then, the damage was done. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, Malik. This was pure prejudice, and it's exactly the kind of behavior we've been trying to reform. Well, now it's personal, and I'm done letting it slide. Malik nodded, his expression resolute as he took in Elijah's words. So, what's the plan? How are we going to address this? Elijah's eyes burned with determination as he looked up at City Hall, the weight of his responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. First, I'm filing a formal complaint against this officer. I already have his badge number. Then, we're going to take this up with Chief Harlan. If the department thinks they can brush this under the rug, they're wrong. Malik nodded, his jaw set with determination. And what about the bigger picture? This is about more than one officer's behavior, right? Exactly, Elijah replied. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a culture that enables profiling and abuse of authority. I've been talking about reform for too long without the right leverage, but now I have the evidence. This isn't just a theory. It's happened to me, and it can happen to anyone. We need accountability, and we need transparency. This ends now. Malik's face softened with understanding, and he placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. Whatever you need, I'm with you. The community will be behind you too. Good, Elijah said, taking a deep breath, his resolve only hardening. This isn't going to be easy. The department will push back. The officer will try to downplay what happened, maybe even spin the story. But we're not backing down. Malik looked at him, a faint smile of support on his face. And how are you holding up? Physically? Elijah touched his bruised jaw, wincing slightly as he remembered the force of the officer's punch. I'll be fine. It's not the first time I've taken a hit, but this one is different. It's not just personal. It's a wake-up call. We need to make sure this never happens to anyone else. They stood there in the quiet night outside City Hall, the weight of the night's events settling into a shared sense of purpose. Elijah felt a spark of energy, a deep, driving force that told him this was more than just a fight for justice. This was his chance to finally act, to turn the injustice he'd faced into something meaningful. It was time to set the wheels of change in motion, and he wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. Elijah was done with empty promises. This time, he would bring real change, no matter what it took. The next morning, Elijah walked into the city's police precinct with Malik by his side. His jaw still throbbed, a physical reminder of the previous night's events, but he held his head high, determined to address the injustice he had faced head-on. Sunlight streamed through the precinct's windows, casting long shadows across the tiled floor as officers moved through the building, some glancing up and doing a double take when they saw him. Elijah walked purposefully toward the front desk, where a young officer looked up from her paperwork, eyes widening slightly as she recognized him. "Mayor Brooks," she stammered, glancing nervously at his bruised jaw. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes," Elijah replied firmly. "I need to speak with Chief Harlan. Tell him it's urgent." The officer nodded, quickly picking up the phone to relay the message. Within minutes, Chief Harlan appeared from his office at the back of the precinct. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with streaks of gray in his hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. His eyes flicked to Elijah's bruised jaw, and a look of concern, mixed with apprehension, crossed his face. He extended a hand, which Elijah pointedly ignored. "Mr. Brooks," Harlan said, his voice carefully measured, "why don't we step into my office?" Without waiting for a response, Chief Harlan led them down a narrow hallway to his office. The air was thick with tension as the door closed behind them, and Chief Harlan gestured for them to sit. Elijah remained standing, his posture tense, eyes locked on the chief. "Look," Harlan began, clearing his throat, "I understand there was an incident last night involving one of my officers. I've already reviewed the report. This seems to be a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Elijah's voice was sharp, the anger barely contained. "I was harassed, assaulted, and nearly arrested for standing on a public sidewalk. That officer didn't care about anything I said. He saw me, made assumptions, and acted on them. And you call that a misunderstanding?" Chief Harlan's expression tightened, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "Mr. Brooks, you have to understand, our officers are trained to be cautious. They deal with dangerous situations daily, and sometimes, yes, they have to make judgment calls. Elijah's gaze was unyielding as he replied, "A judgment call? A judgment call based on nothing but his own prejudice? I didn't pose any threat, Chief. I told him what I was doing, but he ignored it and treated me like a criminal. This isn't about caution. It's about abuse of power." Harlan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then leaned forward, his tone more serious. "Mr. Brooks, I understand your frustration, and I take your concerns seriously, but I assure you, our officers are trained to follow protocol." "Then your protocols are broken," Elijah replied, his voice steely. "Your officer didn't ask for an explanation. He made up his mind the moment he saw me. I expect accountability, Chief Harlan. This isn't just going to be brushed under the rug." Before Harlan could respond, the door opened, and Officer Greg Mason walked in, his face pale and drawn. He glanced nervously at Elijah, but quickly looked away, the weight of his actions clearly beginning to sink in. Chief Harlan motioned for him to sit, his expression unreadable. Elijah took a step forward, his eyes locked on Mason, his voice unwavering. "Tell me, Officer Mason, what exactly were you thinking last night when you decided to escalate a simple situation into an assault?" Mason shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Elijah's gaze. I didn't know who you were," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "You didn't know?" Elijah's tone was icy. "You didn't know because you didn't care to find out. Instead, you saw what you wanted to see, a person who didn't belong, and you acted on that." Chief Harlan's face grew serious as he turned to Mason. "Officer Mason, your behavior is unacceptable. You're expected to de-escalate situations, not turn them into conflicts. Why didn't you?" Mason's gaze flicked between Harlan and Elijah, his voice shaky. I thought he was. I didn't know he was." Elijah cut him off, his voice rising with controlled fury. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you saw someone and made a decision based purely on bias. And that's the problem with this entire department, if officers like you think they can get away with it." Chief Harlan cleared his throat, his tone more serious as he addressed Mason. "I've already placed you on suspension, pending an internal investigation. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated." Mason opened his mouth as if to protest, but Harlan's cold stare silenced him. Elijah looked at the chief, his face unrelenting. "Suspension isn't enough, Harlan. This isn't just about one officer. It's about the culture in your department that enables officers to act on these biases without consequence. That ends now." Chief Harlan's jaw clenched, and he nodded reluctantly. "I understand, Mr. Brooks. We'll conduct a full investigation and make the necessary changes." Elijah's voice softened but held firm authority. "I want this investigation to be public. The people need to see that we're not protecting our own at their expense." The battle for justice was just beginning, and Elijah was ready to take it all the way to the top. Elijah's eyes stayed trained on Officer Mason, watching him squirm under the weight of the truth that had finally surfaced. In the quiet room, the air grew thick with tension, every unspoken word pressing down on Mason like a heavy weight. Elijah crossed his arms, his stance firm as he prepared to lay out exactly why this behavior had to stop. Not just for himself, but for everyone who faced similar treatment every day. Mason cleared his throat, his eyes darting around the room, searching for support. "Mr. Brooks," he stammered, still not fully meeting Elijah's gaze. I didn't realize." Elijah's voice cut through the officer's weak excuses like a blade. "Let's be honest here, Officer Mason. You acted on an assumption. The second you saw me, you decided I didn't belong, and nothing I said mattered after that. Am I right?" Mason swallowed hard, his face paling under Elijah's unwavering stare. "Look, I was following my training," he mumbled. "We're trained to be cautious, to spot potential threats." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his tone firm. "Potential threats?" He took a step closer, eyes narrowed. "Standing outside a store in a suit, waiting for a ride, is a potential threat? The real threat here is an officer who doesn't question his own bias before acting. You didn't listen. You didn't ask questions. And now here we are." Mason shifted uncomfortably, his voice rising defensively. "I've seen this before, people saying they're just waiting when they're really casing the place. I did what I thought was necessary." Elijah's face hardened. "But you thought wrong, and your necessary actions have consequences. You're the one who didn't belong in that situation, Mason. You don't deserve to wear that badge if that's how you treat innocent people." Chief Harlan, watching the tense exchange, finally intervened, his voice strained but commanding. "Officer Mason, this isn't just a training issue. It's about your judgment and your actions. We've reviewed the body cam footage. There was no reason to escalate the situation." Mason's expression shifted from defiance to fear, his eyes flickering toward Harlan and back to Elijah. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself again, but the chief's cold gaze silenced him. Harlan's tone grew stern. "Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay. A full investigation will determine your future with this department." Elijah didn't flinch, his voice still steady. "Chief Harlan, if this investigation ends in anything less than termination, we're sending a message that officers can act without accountability." He turned to face Harlan directly, his words sharp. "This needs to go further than just one suspension. It's time for this department to take responsibility for the way it operates." Chief Harlan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, conceding Elijah's point. "I hear you, Mr. Brooks, and I agree this department needs to rebuild its trust with the community. We'll be reevaluating our policies." Elijah nodded, his expression resolute. "Good, because this isn't about me. It's about every single person in this city who feels unsafe, unprotected, or even threatened by the people meant to protect them. We need a public report on this investigation and real, visible reforms, nothing less." Mason's shoulders slumped as he realized the gravity of his actions. His head bowed under the weight of Elijah's words. Elijah turned to him one final time. "Officer Mason, this is the last time you'll treat someone like that without consequence. Whether you stay on the force or not, I hope you learn from this." Mason finally managed to meet Elijah's gaze, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Elijah's expression remained impassive. "I don't need an apology. I need change, and you're going to face the consequences of your actions. This is only the beginning." Bookmark. The consequences of Mason's actions were finally catching up with him, but for Elijah, this was a fight that had only just begun. Elijah left the precinct with Malik at his side, feeling the weight of the confrontation settling over him. It was a victory, yes, but a small one. The culture he was fighting against was deeply embedded, woven into the fabric of the very department sworn to protect the city. He had taken the first steps, but there was so much further to go. Back at City Hall, Elijah sat in his office, staring at the city outside his window, the sprawling streets filled with people who deserved better than the injustices they endured daily. This was the moment he had been pushing toward, a chance to bring about true change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had felt the cold sting of unfair treatment. He couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip by. Malik entered the room, his face resolute. "Elijah, the media's been calling nonstop. They're all over the story. We could hold a press conference. You could get out in front of this before the department tries to spin it." Elijah nodded, the decision solidifying in his mind. "Set it up. This needs to be public. People deserve to hear the truth, unfiltered." Within hours, the press had gathered outside City Hall. Reporters and cameramen jostled for position, their voices buzzing with questions and anticipation. Elijah adjusted his tie, his expression calm but intense, before stepping out to face the crowd. As he approached the podium, the chatter quieted, and the flashing cameras captured his every move. "Good afternoon," Elijah began, his voice steady and clear. "I've called this press conference to address an incident that occurred last night involving myself and a police officer in this city." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Elijah paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Last night, while waiting outside a store, I was approached by an officer who assumed that I was there with malicious intent. Despite my calm explanations, the situation quickly escalated. I was assaulted, handcuffed, and nearly arrested, simply for standing on a sidewalk." The crowd stirred, shocked gasps and murmurs spreading as reporters took notes furiously. Elijah continued, his gaze sweeping over the gathering. "This was not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a larger issue, a culture within our police department that allows assumptions and prejudice to dictate actions rather than the facts." He let the words linger, watching as the crowd hung on his every word. "This officer didn't see me as a person. And he didn't listen to a word I said. He saw a stereotype, an assumption, and acted on it. And I have no doubt that what happened to me has happened to countless others in this city who didn't have the power or the platform to speak out. Elijah glanced at Malik, who gave him a supportive nod and continued with renewed determination. This isn't just about one officer or one mistake. This is about a system that allows these assumptions to flourish unchecked. It's about a culture that fails to question its own biases, one that ultimately leads to mistrust, fear, and even violence. A hush had fallen over the crowd, and Elijah's voice grew more impassioned as he spoke. I am calling for a full investigation into the actions of this officer, and I will ensure that it is public, transparent, and accountable. This department will not hide behind closed doors or silent excuses. The people of this city deserve better. Reporters began shouting questions, their voices eager for answers, but Elijah held up his hand, signaling for quiet. I also want to make it clear that this fight is about more than one investigation. We will be pushing for systemic reform, for real, lasting change in our police department. No one in this city should fear the people who are sworn to protect them, and I will not rest until that trust is rebuilt. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd as he finished, a show of support from community members who had come to listen, to witness, and to demand change alongside him. Elijah stepped away from the podium, his heart pounding as he felt the intensity of the moment wash over him. He had ignited something here, and he knew that momentum was now on his side. Malik met him at the steps of City Hall, a determined smile on his face. You did it, Elijah. The people are behind you. Elijah nodded, feeling a surge of hope amidst the tension. This is just the beginning. Now we hold the system accountable. We keep pushing until they have no choice but to change. Bookmark, the call for justice had been sounded, and Elijah wouldn't stop until every voice in the city was heard. As Elijah returned to his office, the atmosphere in City Hall was electric. Calls flooded in from local activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens offering their support. The story of his encounter had spread like wildfire across social media, sparking conversations and debates on every platform. The city was waking up to a call for justice, and Elijah was at the center of it all. Malik scrolled through his phone, his eyes widening as he took in the community's reaction. Elijah, the response is overwhelming. People are rallying behind you. Community leaders, advocacy groups, even folks who normally wouldn't get involved, they're all reaching out to stand with you. Elijah nodded, a faint smile breaking through his serious expression. Good. They're seeing the truth of what's happening, and they're ready to fight for change. We're not alone in this. Malik handed Elijah his phone, showing him a social media post from a well-known activist in the city, calling for a peaceful demonstration outside the police department to demand transparency and accountability. They're organizing a protest, Malik said, a hint of excitement in his voice. People want to be heard. By the end of the day, hundreds of people had gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "Justice Now," "Stop Profiling," and "Accountability for All." The crowd was diverse, with people from all walks of life coming together to demand change. The energy was palpable, a tangible force fueled by years of frustration and a collective yearning for justice. Elijah watched the live footage from his office window, feeling a swell of pride. The people of this city were ready to fight for what was right, and he knew he owed it to them to keep pushing forward. He took a deep breath, grounding himself in the reality of the moment. This was no longer about just his experience. It was about a movement, a demand for a police department that treated every citizen with respect and dignity. The press gathered to cover the protest, interviewing people in the crowd, many of whom shared their own stories of being unfairly profiled or harassed. A woman holding a sign approached a reporter, her voice clear and unwavering. "I've lived in this city my whole life, and I've never felt safe around the people who are supposed to protect me. Mayor Brooks standing up against this is the hope we've been waiting for. He's giving us a voice." Her words rippled through the crowd, sparking cheers and applause. Elijah felt his resolve harden. This was the power of unity, of people standing together for a shared cause. The pressure was building, and the department would have no choice but to address it. As the protest continued, Malik knocked on Elijah's office door, his expression serious. "Elijah, You're getting some pushback from the police union. They've released a statement saying that you're undermining the department and that your actions are causing unnecessary friction between officers and the community. Elijah's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone measured. Let them say what they want, Malik. The truth is on our side. This isn't about undermining anything. It's about fixing a broken system. Malik nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. People are rallying because they know you're serious about this. The union may push back, but the community is louder. The protest lasted well into the evening, with chants echoing through the streets and voices demanding justice. As the crowd dispersed, Elijah knew that the spark of change had been ignited. People were ready to hold their leaders accountable, to demand a police force that truly served and protected. Elijah picked up his phone and sent out a statement on his social media, addressing the protest and the police union's response. Change is never easy, he wrote, but it is necessary. To those who stood outside today, know that your voices were heard. This movement is about all of us, about a safer and more just future for everyone in our city. His post was met with an outpouring of support, with thousands of comments echoing his call for justice. Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose as he read the words of encouragement from people across the city. They believed in him, in this movement, and he was determined not to let them down. With the city rallying behind him, Elijah knew there was no turning back. The fight for justice was now a movement too powerful to ignore. The next morning, Elijah awoke to a fresh wave of media coverage. News anchors debated his actions, while articles dissected every detail of his speech and the rally that had brought the city's streets to life. But alongside the support, a fierce resistance was building. By noon, the police union's official response came in. A lengthy press release accusing Elijah of grandstanding and jeopardizing officer morale. Elijah read through the union's statement, noting how they had twisted his words, portraying him as anti-police rather than pro-accountability. Malik, sitting across from him, looked up from his own copy of the statement, frustration evident on his face. They're painting you as an enemy of the force, Malik muttered, shaking his head. They're saying you're risking officer safety by rallying people against them. Elijah took a deep breath, his face calm but his eyes fierce. They're scared, Malik, scared of losing the power they've held on to without accountability. If they have to bend the truth to keep their grip, they will. Malik set down the statement and leaned forward. We need to respond. People will want to hear what you have to say about this. We can't let them control the narrative. Elijah nodded, already considering his next steps. Set up an interview, he said. We're going to make it clear that this isn't about officer safety, it's about community safety. There's no safety in a system that treats innocent people like criminals. Within hours, Elijah was seated in front of a news anchor for a live interview. The studio lights cast a harsh glow, but he felt nothing but resolve as the cameras rolled. The anchor began. Mr. Brooks, the police union has stated that your actions are creating division in the city and putting officers at risk. How do you respond to that? Elijah looked directly into the camera, his voice calm but resolute. I believe in our city's police force. I know there are good officers out there, officers who want to do the right thing. But we can't ignore the fact that there are systemic issues, and ignoring them doesn't make us safer, it makes us less safe. This is about holding everyone from top to bottom accountable. The anchor continued. Some critics are saying that you're inciting anger against the police. How do you address those concerns? Elijah shook his head. This isn't about anger against the police. It's about demanding that they live up to their oath to protect and serve. When there's trust between the community and law enforcement, we're all safer. Right now, that trust has been broken, and we can't restore it with silence or denial. We restore it by making real changes that show we're serious about justice for everyone. The anchor nodded, a look of respect in her eyes. And what are the next steps? What specific changes do you envision? Elijah didn't hesitate. We're working on a comprehensive reform package that includes independent oversight, mandatory de-escalation and bias training, and a transparent public reporting system for complaints. This isn't about weakening the police force. It's about strengthening it by ensuring that it truly serves all of us. The interview concluded, and almost immediately, social media erupted with support. People tweeted messages of encouragement, praising Elijah's commitment to change and his refusal to back down under pressure. But the union wasn't finished yet. By the next morning, they had organized their own rally, gathering officers and supporters outside City Hall, with signs reading, "Support our officers," and "No to political interference." Elijah watched from his office window as the police union's rally took place. Their voices were loud, the crowd sizable, and he knew this was their way of pushing back. But he didn't feel intimidated. Instead, he felt more certain than ever that he was on the right path. Malik walked in, glancing out the window at the rally below. "Looks like they're trying to match your energy." Elijah gave a slight nod. "Let them try. The community stands with us because they see the truth in what we're fighting for. This isn't about politics, it's about accountability." Malik sighed, glancing back at him. "So, what's the plan? How do we keep the momentum going?" Elijah turned back to the rally below, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We keep moving forward. We have the community's attention. And now we need to bring our proposal to the council. The louder they get, the clearer we make our case for change. We're not backing down." The battle lines were drawn, but Elijah knew that with the community by his side, their movement for justice was unstoppable. Elijah didn't waste any time. The morning after the union's rally, he gathered his allies on the city council to begin drafting his proposed reforms. They spent hours poring over each detail, from establishing an independent oversight committee to implementing mandatory de-escalation and bias training. Every aspect of the proposal was designed to rebuild trust between the police and the people they served. By the time the proposal was finalized, Elijah and his team had crafted a comprehensive package that directly addressed the issues exposed by his encounter with Officer Mason. But he knew that bringing these reforms to life wouldn't be easy. The council was deeply divided, and he anticipated fierce opposition from members aligned with the police union. The council meeting room was packed the day of the vote. City Hall's chambers overflowed with people. Activists, community members, and officers who had come to see the fate of the reform package. The energy in the room was thick with anticipation, a quiet tension humming as council members took their seats. As Elijah stood to address the council, he felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began. "Members of the council, residents of this city, today we have an opportunity, a responsibility, to take meaningful action for our community. These reforms are not about weakening our police force, but about strengthening it. When we ensure that every officer is held accountable, when we provide the training needed to prevent situations from escalating, we build a department that truly serves and protects everyone." He scanned the room, his gaze settling on each council member, one by one. "This is not a fight against our officers. It's a fight for the integrity of our entire system. When people trust their police department, everyone wins. And right now, that trust has been eroded." Councilwoman Green, one of his most vocal allies, leaned forward and spoke up. "Mayor Brooks, I agree with you wholeheartedly. We must rebuild trust, and these reforms are a necessary first step. Our community is demanding it." But not everyone was on Elijah's side. Councilman Reed, a longtime supporter of the police union, his head, his expression skeptical. "With all due respect, Mayor, I think this proposal goes too far. We're creating a system where our officers are constantly under scrutiny, second-guessed by people who don't understand the dangers they face every day." Elijah looked directly at Councilman Reed, his voice calm but firm. "Scrutiny and accountability are not the same as second-guessing, Councilman. Accountability is what allows people to trust the force, to see it as a partner in their safety. Without it, we risk losing the very fabric that ties our community together." Reed's expression soured, but he didn't respond. Elijah continued, his words carrying a quiet urgency. "Our city deserves a police department that reflects its values. We have to take this step, not because it's easy, but because it's right." After an hour of debate, the council took a vote. Each member cast their decision, and the room fell silent as the votes were tallied. Malik, seated in the back of the room, leaned forward, his fists clenched in silent anticipation. Finally, the council secretary announced the result. The reform package had passed by a narrow margin. The room erupted into applause from community members and activists who had come to witness the decision. Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he kept his expression calm. He knew that while this was a victory, it was just the beginning. Malik rushed up to him as the room began to clear, a triumphant smile on his face. "Elijah, we did it! The reforms are going through." Elijah nodded, his own smile breaking through as he clasped Malik's shoulder. "This is a win, Malik, a big one. But now comes the real challenge, making sure these changes are fully implemented." As they stepped out of City Hall, reporters swarmed Elijah, their questions flying fast. "Mayor Brooks, how do you feel about the vote?" one asked. "Do you think these reforms will be enough to bring real change?" another added. Elijah looked out at the crowd, his voice steady but passionate. "Today's vote is a victory for accountability and transparency. It's a step toward rebuilding trust in our police department. But it's only the first step. We'll need commitment from everyone involved to make sure these reforms are implemented fully and effectively. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but with persistence and community support, it does happen." As he finished speaking, the applause from the gathered crowd filled the air. People were hopeful, ready to see this vision come to life, and Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The community was counting on him, and he had no intention of letting them down. With the reforms passed, Elijah's journey was far from over. Now he had to make sure the system changed for good. Elijah had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated just how fiercely the system would push back against his reforms. Days passed since the council's vote, and while the community celebrated, Elijah was beginning to feel the weight of the real battle ahead. Every step forward felt like moving through quicksand, with endless delays, bureaucratic obstacles, and stalling tactics from those who wanted the changes to quietly disappear. Malik stormed into Elijah's office one morning, visibly frustrated as he tossed a report onto the desk. "It's worse than we thought, Elijah. The department's dragging its feet on every requirement. Nothing's moving forward. Training, oversight, implementation, any of it." Elijah scanned the report, his expression hardening as he read. "This is exactly what they want. They're trying to wear us down, hoping the community's attention fades." Malik nodded, his face grim. "The internal review board hasn't even started on Officer Mason's case. They're hiding behind red tape, delaying the investigation under the excuse of comprehensive review. They're betting that, with time, the public will lose interest and will move on." Elijah clenched his jaw. He'd put everything on the line to get the reforms passed, and now it seemed like the department was intent on burying them. He looked at Malik, a steely determination in his eyes. "We can't let them get away with this. If they want to stall, we're going to make it impossible for them to hide." That afternoon, Elijah called a meeting with his team. "We're taking this public again. They think they can ignore the council's vote, but we're going to make sure everyone knows what's happening behind the scenes. Malik, I want a press conference set up by the end of the week." Malik nodded, already making calls. "We're not letting this go," he said, a fierce resolve in his voice. "If they're going to fight this hard against transparency, we'll shine a spotlight on every corner of it." The press conference was held on the steps of City Hall, and by now, Elijah was no stranger to the crowd of reporters and community members who had come to hear the latest updates. As he stepped up to the podium, he didn't hesitate, his voice clear and direct. "Good afternoon. Since the council's vote, we've encountered significant resistance to implementing the changes we've passed. The delays are not accidental. This is a deliberate effort to ignore the voices of this city and keep the status quo intact. But let me make one thing clear. These reforms will be enforced, and we will not back down." The crowd murmured, voices of both surprise and anger rippling through the gathering. Elijah continued, his voice rising with conviction. "We demanded accountability, and we were promised change. The people of this city voted for leaders who would bring progress, not excuses. To every official, every officer, and every department leader who thinks they can stall these reforms until we forget, think again. We're here, and we're not going anywhere." One reporter raised a hand, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Mayor Brooks, Do you believe there's an intentional effort within the department to sabotage the reforms? Elijah met her gaze, his expression unwavering. Yes, I do. The delay tactics and the lack of movement on investigations are not coincidental. They are strategies meant to protect those who fear accountability. But we are exposing these actions because the community deserves to know that their safety and trust are being delayed by those who resist change. As he finished, a ripple of applause broke out from community members in the crowd, and Elijah felt a surge of support from the people who were now standing by him, ready to see this fight through to the end. After the press conference, Elijah and Malik returned to the office, where calls and messages of encouragement poured in. But alongside the support, there were also messages from city officials and even threats from those who resented the growing momentum for reform. They're trying to intimidate us, Malik said, scrolling through the responses with a frown. But they don't realize it's only making us push harder. Elijah nodded, feeling the pressure mounting but refusing to let it deter him. If they're this threatened, it means we're making progress. We're going to keep pressing until every part of this reform is implemented, whether they like it or not. The resistance was stronger than he'd expected, but Elijah was ready for the fight. The system would change, or he would force it to. As weeks turned into months, the delays from the department only intensified. Frustration in the community was mounting, with calls from local leaders, activists, and residents demanding more transparency on the internal review of Officer Mason's conduct. Elijah knew he was running out of time to keep the public's trust. If he didn't escalate, the system would sweep everything under the rug. One evening, as Elijah reviewed the latest stalled updates, Malik walked into his office, looking as resolute as ever. Elijah, I think it's time to make our move. People are asking why there's still no word on Mason's investigation. We've tried to let the department handle it, but now they're just stringing us along. Maybe it's time we release Mason's name. Elijah looked up, his eyes meeting Malik's with a quiet, determined intensity. I wanted to give the department a chance to do this the right way, but they're leaving us no choice. If we don't make this public, it'll just be another story that fades, another injustice forgotten. Malik nodded, already preparing for what would be a major announcement. Once you say his name, there's no going back. The community will demand action, and the pressure on the department will be undeniable. The following day, Elijah prepared himself to address the public once more. He knew this decision would bring backlash, but it was the only way to force transparency. He took a deep breath and stepped out onto the steps of City Hall, facing the press and a crowd that had gathered to hear what he had to say. Good afternoon, he began, his voice clear and unwavering. When we voted for these reforms, we promised the people of this city transparency and accountability. But since that day, our progress has been met with delay after delay, silence after silence. The investigation into Officer Mason, the officer involved in my own encounter, has stalled beyond reason. And today, I'm here to address that. The crowd fell silent, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Elijah continued, the officer responsible for that encounter, the one who wrongfully detained and assaulted me, is named Greg Mason. His name has been hidden long enough, and the people of this city deserve to know the truth. A murmur spread through the crowd, and reporters quickly scribbled notes and whispered to one another. Elijah held up his hand, signaling for their attention once more. Officer Mason's actions were not just about me. They are emblematic of a larger problem within the department. Too often, we see officers act without consequence, protected by a culture that values silence over accountability. By releasing this information, I'm sending a message. Accountability will not be hidden. Reporters began shouting questions, the crowd buzzing with energy, but Elijah continued, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. This is not about one officer alone. It is about a system that allows people in power to act without fear of consequences. We are moving forward with every reform we've promised, and today's announcement is a reminder that these changes will happen, no matter the opposition. The moment Elijah finished speaking, the questions erupted. Mayor Brooks, are you concerned about backlash from the police union? Do you believe this will put pressure on other officers involved in similar incidents? Elijah met each question calmly, answering with resolve. The police union's stance doesn't change the truth. People in this city deserve safety and justice, and they deserve to know the names and actions of those who serve them. If the union chooses to protect Officer Mason at the cost of transparency, then they will answer to the community. That evening, news stations across the city aired segments on Elijah's announcement. With his words played over and over, the community's response was immediate. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding updates on the investigation into Mason and calling for a swift, fair judgment. The department found itself under intense scrutiny, facing calls from both residents and officials to conclude the investigation openly. Back in his office, Elijah watched the news coverage alongside Malik, who looked visibly relieved. "You did the right thing," Malik said, a hint of pride in his voice. "They can't hide behind bureaucracy anymore. The community won't let this go." Elijah nodded, his face both calm and resolute. "I know the pushback will be intense. The union will claim I'm undermining the department, but this isn't about undermining anyone. It's about upholding the people's right to transparency. We're in this for the long haul." As they watched, Elijah felt the weight of the responsibility settles on him. The road ahead would be even tougher, but he was committed. This fight wasn't just about one officer or one moment. It was about changing a system that had long operated in secrecy and bringing accountability into the light. Elijah had pushed the system into the spotlight, but now he had to brace himself for the storm that was coming. The day after Elijah revealed Officer Mason's name, the backlash was immediate and intense. The police union held an emergency meeting where union leaders accused Elijah of inciting public outrage and endangering officer safety by releasing Mason's identity. Across the city, supporters of the police department voiced concerns, and union representatives were quick to appear on news stations, arguing that Elijah's reforms would lead to a breakdown of public order. But amidst the criticism, the community remained steadfast. Activists organized demonstrations, community leaders held forums, and a powerful call for accountability echoed throughout the city. People from all walks of life stood behind Elijah's reforms, insisting that a transparent police department was the first step toward rebuilding trust. Elijah knew that his next move was critical. He arranged a meeting with the police union and high-ranking officers, determined to confront them directly. The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with tension as he entered, his expression resolute. At the head of the table sat Union President Dan Mercer, a broad-shouldered man with a piercing glare, his arms crossed defensively. Several officers sat beside him, their expressions ranging from nervous to hostile. Mercer wasted no time. "Mayor Brooks, your actions have put our officers in a difficult position," he began, his tone harsh. "By releasing Officer Mason's name, you've undermined morale, and now we're seeing anger directed at our department like never before." Elijah met Mercer's gaze, his voice calm but unyielding. "President Mercer, my actions have put your officers in a position of accountability, not difficulty. This isn't about targeting anyone. This is about ensuring that the people who wear a badge and carry authority are held to the same standard of accountability as anyone else." Mercer scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "This city needs officers who aren't afraid to make quick decisions in dangerous situations. With your reforms, you're putting them under a microscope. How can they do their job with the public second-guessing every action they take?" Elijah didn't flinch. "These reforms aren't about second-guessing. They're about building trust. When the public sees transparency, they see that the department is willing to hold itself accountable. That trust makes officers' jobs easier, not harder." One of the officers leaned forward, his voice tinged with anger. "Mayor Brooks, you talk about trust, but trust goes both ways. You're pushing an agenda that feels anti-police. You're turning the city against us." Elijah's eyes flashed, his tone sharpening. "I'm not turning the city against anyone. This is about giving the city reasons to believe in its police force again. Do you want to trust? Then show the people that their safety matters to you as much as your own comfort does. This is a chance to prove that those who serve this city hold themselves to the highest standard." Mercer's face hardened. "If you keep pushing, you're going to drive good officers away. They're already talking about transferring out, looking for places where they're appreciated and respected. Elijah leaned in, his voice calm but cutting. If accountability drives officers away, then maybe they shouldn't be here in the first place. This department is not above the people it serves. If the union can't support a reform that makes policing safer and fairer for everyone, then we're going to move forward without you. The silence in the room was deafening. Mercer looked at Elijah, his defiant expression fading as he realized the mayor's determination was unbreakable. Elijah stood, glancing around the room. This isn't a negotiation. This is about doing what's right. You can either be part of the solution, or you can continue to be the obstacle standing in the way of progress. Without waiting for a response, Elijah walked out, leaving Mercer and the officers in stunned silence. The following morning, he called a press conference to inform the public that, despite union resistance, every reform was moving forward on schedule. These reforms, he announced, will bring accountability, transparency, and trust back to our city. No amount of resistance will change that. The public response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in, and the city council backed Elijah's commitment, promising to ensure that every aspect of the reform package would be fully implemented. Community leaders praised his courage, calling it the leadership the city had been waiting for. As the days turned into weeks, the reforms began to take shape. Independent oversight committees were established, training programs launched, and a public complaint system made available. For the first time, the department began releasing monthly updates on complaints and actions taken against officers, a level of transparency unheard of before Elijah's intervention. In his office one evening, Elijah looked out over the city, the lights stretching far into the distance. Malik entered, smiling as he held up the latest public report showing increased public approval and trust in the police force. "We did it, Elijah. The city's changing because of you." Elijah nodded, his expression softened with relief. "This isn't just about me, Malik. It's about everyone who stood up, who believed we could make things better." He felt a surge of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, real change had finally taken root. Elijah had achieved a victory. But this was just the beginning of a new era, one where justice and accountability would finally lead the way forward. Elijah's journey was a powerful reminder of the courage required to stand up against deeply ingrained systems. His fight wasn't just about one person or one incident. It was about bringing true accountability to an institution that had long operated in the shadows, unchecked. The strength of Elijah's leadership came from his unwavering commitment to justice, not only for himself but for every member of his community who had felt the weight of prejudice and discrimination. By pushing for reforms, Elijah shined a light on the need for transparency, proving that the path to trust is paved with honesty and responsibility. This story serves as a reflection on the importance of leaders who are willing to risk their own comfort to create a fairer system for everyone. Elijah's determination reminds us that meaningful change is possible when we confront injustice with courage, even in the face of fierce opposition. Through his example, we learn that the fight for justice is never just one battle. It's a commitment to continuously stand up for what's right, no matter how challenging the road ahead. For all of us watching, Elijah's journey is an inspiring call to action. It reminds us that no matter where we stand, we all have a voice in shaping a more just world. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with persistent effort, each step we take brings us closer to a society where everyone is truly seen, respected, and valued. If you think this story was good, press 1 in the comments. If you think it was amazing, press 2. And we'd love to hear your own stories. Feel free to share them below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Let us know your thoughts on Elijah's journey in the comments below.